Welcome, everyone. My name is David Wood. It's my privilege to chair London Futurists. Our topic in this online gathering is Beyond Smoke and Mirrors, Seeing Through the Technology Hype. Before I say more about the topic, I'll ask our three panelists to each briefly introduce themselves. Gemma.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gemma Milne. I'm a science and technology writer and the author of the book that you would have seen in the event description, Smoke and Mirrors, How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It. And I'm really excited to share some ideas and get some of your questions and hear what you guys think about some of the provocations that we're going to put forward today. Thank you very much.
And where are you connecting from?
Oh, Bethnal Green, East London.
Bethnal Green, East London.
Despite my accent.
Right. Jack.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jack Stilgo. I am an associate professor of science and technology studies at University College London. So I teach and research things to do with where policy meets new technologies. I, earlier this year, published a book called Who's Driving Innovation? New Technologies and the Collaborative State, which had a big chunk all about hype. And it was in conversations like that, around that I met Gemma and got really excited by her book, which followed mine immediately. And it's I think they're a nice pair.
Great. And where are you connecting from, Jack?
I'm in Stoke Newington, northeast London.
So far we're all in great. Jenny, do you want to say a few words of introduction, please?
Yes, hello, I'm Jenny Kleeman. I'm a journalist and documentary maker. I've made TV programmes for the BBC and Channel 4, and I've written for The Guardian a lot. I make podcasts too. I have also just written a book. Here it is. Well, the book it's not out yet. It's out on the 9th of July. It's called Sex, Robots and Vegan Meat. And it's about 4 inventions that promise to change birth, food, sex and death forever. And those 4 inventions are sex robots, artificial wombs, lab-grown meat and euthanasia machines. And they are all completely suffused with hype. So I had to do a lot of unpicking what was kind of real in the reporting on all of this, but also learning about how seductive stories that aren't necessarily true are to all of us. So I'm really excited to be talking about this tonight. And I'm in Kentish Town in North London. So we're all in London.
Thanks so much. Well, we'll definitely have to discuss more about sex robots, artificial wombs and vegan meat and so on once your book is ready. But for now, let's move on to the main topic. We'll be hearing more from the panelists shortly as they outline their basic stance. But first, a few words from me about the role of technology in improving the world. I'm a technology enthusiast often. Many of you may have heard me before, waxing lyrical about the power of technology to do all kinds of things, make it easier to travel, to communicate, to engage in all kinds of entertainment, to improve medicine. In principle, technology can help us all to reach what we might call a state of abundance, with ample clean energy, ample nutritious food, ample comfortable accommodation, numerous goods and services. But some of you also may have heard me say that technology is not enough. To improve the world, to achieve the kinds of goals that most of us have, to improve our place in the world, we need more than technology. And in part, that's what we'll be discussing in this session. We cannot simply sit back and wait for better technology to arrive, simply courtesy of entrepreneurs, technologists, and the free market. And that's for 2 reasons. The first is that, in the words of a cliche, technology is a two-edged sword. Every area of technology is capable of misuse and abuse, as well as positive use. Second, sadly, the best technology sometimes doesn't even get built. That's because research and development projects are often postponed and cancelled. It's because truly promising technology is often obscured by the hype around other technologies, the technology in which there is presently more money involved or tied up. We get distracted, we lose focus, and we fail to benefit from the real power of technology. At least, that's one of the conclusions I've picked up in the last few days whilst reading Gemma Milne's book, Smoke and Mirrors. Gemma has a lot to say about negative consequences of tech hype, and she has a few things to say about positive consequences too, which we might come on to. In her book, she covers, at some depth, 9 different fields of technology. Emma, why don't you pick up the conversation here? Tell us what led you to research and write this book.
Thank you, David. That was a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that. And hello, everyone, again. So actually, to tell you the truth, when I first started wanting to write Smoke and Mirrors, it really came from a place of frustration around hype. I've been working as a freelance writer, journalist for about 2 years. I was spending a lot of time at technology conferences, at startup conferences, listening to pitches, which I'm sure many of you guys who are listening in are very familiar with, and struggling a little bit with not just headlines written in newspapers or what claims were being made by startups on stage, but also general discourse. When I'd be out chatting with my friends, they'd mention something and I'm going, oh, where did you get that from? No, that's not quite right. And struggling to know how to kind of tackle the hype in me as a communicator, but also as an individual. How could I basically cut through these messages in the best way possible, kind of similar to what Jenny was saying when she was researching her book. So I wanted to basically write something that would say, this is why hype is terrible. We need to bust it. We need to, debunk it, and so on and so forth. And I guess as well, it came from a place of my jobs before I was a freelance journalist. I worked in advertising for a little while, so I was, part of the hype manufacturing machine, shall we say. And I also worked in corporate innovation, where, there's lots of really great corporate innovation stuff that happens by lots of different companies. But there's also a lot of smoke and mirrors in corporate innovation, where sometimes technology and science is used as a way of showing a company to be innovative, when realistically they might not be. Putting a robot in an advert doesn't necessarily mean that you're a tech first company. It means that you know what's trending on Twitter. So so that was part of my job. And before that, I worked in investment banking for a really short amount of time. And again, I was in the team that did IPOs, initial public offerings, and that is a hype based job. Your job is to go around the world and get investors to take a chance on a company that's floating. So I had this kind of shall we say bad view of hype, or quite cynical view of hype, where I was going, I see people making this, it doesn't always add up to the reality, and it's making people believe things that now as a journalist I'm realizing are not true. So that was where I began. But as I started researching and thinking a lot more deeply about hype and really what it is and what role it plays, I interviewed about 60 people for this book. And at the end of every interview, I said to them, could you just tell me what you think hype is? Could you define it? What does it mean to you when I say the word hype? And almost always I got this really emotional reaction of, oh, it's so annoying, it's frustrating, gets in my way, it distracts people. I can't believe people get caught up in it. And it was a very emotional reaction when realistically I was kind of asking for a definition. So when you look at a more logical definition of what hype is, and you see that it's, exaggerated publicity or the use of advertising to get a message across, you realize that hype is just a tool. And just as, David said, tools can be used for both good and bad. There's a double-edged sword to anything that has some kind of purpose in its utility, and hype is one of those. And the way that I decided to kind of define it or give it the context in which I want to talk about it in the book was around this idea of fooling. So the way that I think about fooling is, say you're going to a magic show and you want to see a magician. I would say that you are being consensually fooled. You walk into that show knowing that the magician is going to try to trick you, and you're either fine with that and happy to be tricked, or you're going to try and work it out, but you're very aware of that deliberate intent to mislead. Whereas with non-consensual fooling, otherwise known as lying, it's a very different kind of relationship with intent around this idea of tricking. Hype, on the other hand, is something quite different. It's when a message in the way I think about it, is taken out of context and causes the person receiving it to be accidentally fooled. And that means then that the person who's putting that message out in the first place is not necessarily a nefarious individual or someone who's corrupt, right? That's a very different thing than someone who's exaggerating a message. And sometimes we need to exaggerate messages. You guys probably all, are very aware, particularly people who work in science and tech, sometimes how difficult it is to get attention for what you're doing, particularly when it's complex. So really where I got to was, how do we think about hype better as a tool, learn how to use the tool better, learn how to kind of spot when things start to go wrong and how to basically prevent that from happening in the first place, and eventually kind of put the onus onto the reader of the book as opposed to just the communicators, and say, how do individuals, citizens of society, take on the responsibility of actually trying to critically think around hype, as opposed to us communicators or startups or whatever only being held accountable for putting hype into the world. So that was kind of the general thesis of the book. And I want to just quickly go through 3 quick examples just to make this a little bit more or less, airy-fairy possibly. So the first one I want to do is AI, because that's kind of the main one everyone talks about whenever I say I was writing a book on hype. They say, oh, you must have a chapter on AI. And the particular narrative that I decided to use is robots are stealing your jobs, or robots are going to steal your job. And I think this is a really interesting hyped up narrative, in the sense that a lot of people who don't necessarily know what AI is, understand the current state of robotics, will probably have heard this narrative at some point. It's obviously got really emotional ties to immigrants and this idea of fear around losing your status in society to some kind of other. And I think it's a really dangerous narrative. I think that some people can kind of see it as interesting. It brings up philosophical questions around singularity, around rights of robots, around, are we really creative enough to justify having a job versus a machine that's automated? But if we keep using these narratives, we're, as David rightly pointed out in the introduction, we're distracted. So if I'm to give or to present this narrative in a different way, and instead of saying robots are going to steal your jobs, I say corporate executives are making active decisions to automate menial tasks and replace human labor with that of robots, it's not quite as punchy, and you're unlikely to see that in a headline. But I would say it's a far more true and current description of the situation. And also it prompts maybe people who are not necessarily deep in science and tech, people to understand a bit more deeply what are the inherent current issues in automation and AI right now, as opposed to pushing them into these far future conversations around rights of robots. So this is one kind of example of where a narrative, a hyped up narrative that is there to try and kind of explain the fact that automation is happening, make it interesting, get people excited, and hopefully try and spur a little bit of ethical debate, distracts people away from what I believe are far more important conversations around, reskilling, universal basic income, how do we tax corporations, when do we think it's fair to use automation for profit versus, make sure we're putting the rights of employees first. These are really important discussions we need to have right now, and hype in this sense distracts from that. Another example I wanted to do was there's 9 chapters in the book, and each chapter focuses on a different area. So there's an AI chapter, obviously. Another chapter I have is around space commercialization, and space was an interesting one. When I sent out this chapter to my beta readers, the general feedback I got was like, this is kind of negative, Gemma. You're kind of like killing the dream of space for me. Space is meant to be this really amazing thing that we shall be reaching for the stars and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, there's a reason that I titled the chapter Removing Our Space-Based Rose-Tinted Glasses. And for me, I think some of the hype around areas such as space, where it's got this kind of quite idealistic, visionary vibe around it, particularly around the people leading it like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, we are again distracted from thinking about what is the reality of this as an industry. And if you're to look at the space industry and take it away from the idea of space tourism, going to Mars, colonizing Mars, which even that word has huge inherent issues. But anyway, that's another point, a separate point. If you're to take away this kind of idealistic vision of what space commercialization is and look at the reality of the industry, it's an industry of satellites. That's what the industry is. The reality of it is a business. It's a, very successful industry that already exists, has existed for years, and is now booming because access is much lower. And if we keep talking about space as this very idealistic, exciting, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, and don't look at it like an actual industry that operates right now that has the same inherent issues, power structures, ethical problems, supply chain problems as any other industry, like, healthcare, oil, phones, whatever you want to call it, where we have these conversations quite regularly, it's basically stopping us from analysing and making the industry better by holding it to account. And the final example I wanted to give, I deliberately have chosen my this third one as I figured you guys would maybe resonate with it a bit more, being London Futurists, is the brain-computer interface chapter. And this chapter is interesting because I opened it with examples of sort of sci-fi tech devices that we all kind of want, like that one in the Matrix where you can like plug anything into the back of your head and instantly learn everything you possibly want to learn instantly. I think for any kind of nerd, that is like the absolute dream, right? And another one that I put in was in the movie. I don't think it's actually in the book, but the movie of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's the gun that the woman shoots the man, and the man understands how she's feeling. And I remember watching that for the first time being like, that is the dream. I'm pretty sure every woman wants that gun. That's incredible. And when you look at these two kind of sci-fi...
Not to kill the man, but so that the man can see things from the woman's point of view.
No, he doesn't, man. I think it's called the point of view gun. That's right. And so basically you shoot the man, he kind of goes, woo, and then he's like, oh, wow, that must be really difficult for you. That's really hard. Yes, exactly. Diane hears me. Someone please make this gun. Yeah, that's exactly how I felt when I saw it. And when you think about brain-computer interfaces and if you take away the medical element of it, which is obviously hugely important and really, really amazing technology, and look at the narratives that are around this idea of brain implants, which is learning things fast, being productive, being understood, being able to communicate better. It's essentially a mixture of this point of view gun and the Matrix, USB plug or whatever. And I think that there's something interesting around the fact that we're not necessarily asking a quite important question when it comes to brain-computer interfaces, which is, do we need this? And I think from a medical perspective, the answer is very obviously yes. But when we start talking about devices and kind of fun things that we kind of desire or want, we're again clouded, we're distracted from what could be some really potentially detrimental effects of these kind of devices, particularly when you start thinking about haves and have-nots. There's someone who was able to afford a device that could essentially plug in information to their heads, think how well they would do in exams and job interviews and academia, versus someone who can't afford it or does not have access. So these kind of getting caught up in this want as opposed to need, I think is something that we need to analyze a bit more and be conscious of when it comes to hype. And I wanted to end my little segment with one question that I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on, and maybe we can get into it in the discussion as well, is when we think about hype, we can be critical of those that put it out there, the media, startups, companies, those that have something to gain, I suppose, by narratives being shared widely and believed widely. But we all have a personal responsibility as individuals to critically think around them. That's the kind of conclusion of the book. But considering we're in the company of the London Futurists, one question that I feel I didn't get a chance to answer in the book, and I would love to keep trying to answer moving forward, is what does responsibility mean in the context of futurists? People whose job it is to think about the future, present the future to people, provide inspiration, but also guidance and consultancy and influence. Do we think about the responsibility of what we do enough? And what does responsibility mean when our job is to think about and present something that none of us can actually know for real? So I want to end on that question. Thank you, David.
Well, lots of things to follow up on there. We'll hear from the other panelists first, but maybe I'll give you one question to answer, which has come in the Q&A box. Will there be an ebook version of your book?
Yes, there is a physical version, an ebook version, and if you like the dulcet tones of my Scottish accent, I also read the audiobook, which is also available for pre-order.
All right, so that was probably the easiest question. We'll come back to some of the other ones next. Jack, what's your opening thoughts on this topic?
Thanks, David, and thank you, Gemma, and thank you all of you that have joined in. So, yeah, I'm going to try and not repeat what Gemma said, even though most of what I think is basically what she said. And broadly, that's sort of where I am in this discussion, albeit that I come at this as a professional sociologist that is interested in studying the futures that get imagined by scientists and innovators, asking not just where do those come from, but what are they trying to do? Where are those futures pointing, and why? Maybe I'll come back to just the point that Gemma ended on there, because it's such an important one. It's the question of responsibility, right? That we do sort of think that imagination is a bit of a free lunch, and that, dreaming big dreams, we shouldn't hold people to account for them. But so the chapter in my book that's on hype, I use a quote from W.B. Yeats, which is, I guess, designed to provoke this line of thinking, which is, in dreams begins responsibility, right? It's this prompting the question of, well, maybe it's not a neutral act to imagine particular futures, and maybe people should be held to account for it. I'm particularly interested, I try to resist my sub-discipline of a discipline becoming just Elon Musk studies, but I'm acutely aware that Elon Musk is a sort of role model par excellence for the sorts of things that people like me and I'm sure Gemma are interested in. And in 2017, he made a claim about self-driving cars that seemed, at one level, a sort of rather fanciful thing that we would expect an entrepreneur to say. He said, by the end of this year, you will be able to get in a self-driving car and go from one side of the United States to the other without touching the wheel. Right, and so that was in 2017. And since then, he's repeated the claim, albeit with advancing deadlines. And the question that I have really is, well, is that harmful? Is that problematic? He went on a show with the esteemed journalist Leslie Stahl, and she asked him, why he keeps missing these deadlines, and he was sort of laughing it off. And she was determined not to just engage in a form of comedy with him, but to sort of dig down into what might be a bit of something tragic about hype. And she said, well, a lot of people might accuse you of lying, right? What you're saying about the future to be an outright lie. And he again tried to laugh this off and said, I'm just over enthusiastic. It's a sort of playful, it's part of the, whether you call it the Silicon Valley culture or whether pejoratively you might analyze it as what some have called the Californian ideology. There is, part of the spirit of that particular innovation culture is about making grand claims to give yourself big targets to hit, right? It's the language of moonshots. But academics like me would say, well, it's more than just exuberance, right? It's more than just enthusiasm. There is also a sense in which one group of people are staking claims to a particular future. To Gemma's point about, the positive aspects of hype, that's necessary in some ways because hype organizes cultural and financial resources. Given the massive uncertainties that we face in the future, how do we organize our activities in the present? Well, you make claims about the future such that you try to bring those futures into the present, which leads to a paradox, which is that the more uncertain we are, the more certain we have to be about the claims for those technologies. So we have this perverse situation that self-driving cars actually look more uncertain the more people work on them. And that's actually typical when it comes to new innovations. Is that a problem? Well, it might be a problem in as much as in staking a claim to a particular future, we are overlooking alternative futures. We might be emphasizing particular technologies over others. We might be emphasizing technologies in general over other approaches to innovation or other approaches to social progress. But also, as Gemma pointed out, there's a problem of responsibility there, which is that how do we hold the people making those claims to account? Right? We conventionally, when it comes to new technologies, regulate in hindsight. We wait till there is a technology, we assess its benefits and its risks, we perhaps weigh it up against the public interest, and we say, is this a technology that society wants? I actually run a project called Driverless Futures, which is a 3-year research project that looks in particular at self-driving cars and how you might govern self-driving cars. And the more that we've dug into self-driving cars as an idea, the more we see that actually this is about chasing hype around. It's about saying, well, why do some models of innovation get so much emphasis? And in particular, it's models of innovation based on artificial intelligence, while others don't. And you can explain this in political terms, according to the history of transport, according to the current situation that cities, in particular American cities, find themselves in, where it has become almost impossible to invest in infrastructure. So therefore, the incentives are towards investing in software, which mean that a lot of innovators actually get trapped in this situation of hype. They might sometimes talk about it as a hype cycle. I don't like that phrase, because I think the hype cycle actually becomes self-fulfilling, but it is a form of trap that innovators and the venture capitalists that fund them feel that they have no choice but to work with and repeat the claims of others. They are stuck inside the bubble, and it's in nobody's interest to puncture that bubble. Let me just end with one final thought, which is to say, it's to ask, what might we do about this? Well, how might we get out of this situation, given that accountability is hard, the ascribing of responsibility is really hard, regulation tends to take place after the fact rather than in advance? Well, I would, as somebody that studies scientists, I would look to an optimistic story about the value of science. I have a phrase that I repeat often from an esteemed scientist and technology policy scholar, Harvey Brooks, who said that science should be the conscience of technology. One of the things it should do, especially university science, where you would hope you are not bound by the demands of shareholders or particular government funders, one of the things that science should do is be able to point out all the problems with hype. It should be involved in a systematic hype puncturing exercise. And where science is working well, I think we do see that. We see the scientists asking the difficult questions. The trouble is when science, and in particular university science, becomes enrolled in the same project as the hype creation project itself. And there, I'm afraid, AI looks like a really bad case. So there's a real danger that AI appears to be building up huge momentum and rolling in one direction, rather than what we would ideally like to see from science, which is a diversity of perspectives. We would like to see experimentation and diversity in its most plural form. And I think at the moment, what we don't see is diversity. I'll leave it there, but I look forward to hearing any of the discussion, however it is that we're planning to have this discussion.
Just one question for me, Jack. You talked about the responsibility of futurists, not to present positive futures too uncritically, too positively. Is there also a responsibility when we're projecting negative futures? Because I fear that one of the issues is we have been perceived to cry wolf too many times. We have been talking about, oh, there'll be bad trouble from pandemics. And when the news of the COVID pandemic broke, people said, oh, we've heard this before. We heard the terrible things would happen with SARS. It didn't happen. We heard the terrible things would happen with H1N1. It didn't happen. And so do we have a responsibility to be a little bit more sophisticated in how we describe bad futures as well as the good ones?
I don't actually differentiate, David, hugely between bad futures and good ones. So Gemma mentioned the point about robots taking our jobs, right? That might be seen as a pessimistic view, but actually it's part of the same view of robot hype, right? Which is that it serves some people's interests and it avoids us concentrating on the issues that really matter. And Gemma's absolutely spot on. So whether we think that's a positive future or a negative future, I think is neither here nor there. The point is that it's expressed with such certainty. And the real challenge, I think, in this space is being able to talk about the uncertainties that bedevil us. And especially when you consider something like a pandemic, because scientists will often feel the need to express their concerns in certain terms because this shit really matters, right? And they will want to get their point across, and they will want to get it across clearly. Expressing uncertainty in public is not something that scientists nor innovators are very comfortable with. And I think that's the big thing that we have to work on.
Lots more to discuss there as well. But in the meantime, let's hear from the third panelist, Jenny Kleeman. What would you like to add to the conversation?
Well, I'm coming from a slightly different perspective to Gemma and Jack. I'm not an academic, and the sort of journalism I do, I am an investigative journalist, but I do reportage where I sort of meet lots of different people whilst they're actually doing their jobs and write about my encounters with those people. And my experience of hype, obviously in writing a book about 4 different inventions that sound very science fiction, but that people are working on right now. As part of this, I had to look at the stories that we like to tell ourselves and the stories that we want to hear. And when I say we, I mean members of the public, I mean journalists, and also academics as well, and campaigners. And how I think a lot of the traction that hype can have comes from how seductive it is and how much we want to hear those stories, either because they're entertaining or because they give us something to campaign against. And I wanted to give you a few examples of this. I wanted to tell you the story of the first ever sex robot, the first robot ever to be unveiled in public, is a robot called Roxy True Companion. And she was developed by a guy called Douglas Hines. He has a company called True Companion. Douglas told me that he set up True Companion when his father was in a nursing home. His father had had a stroke and was left with lots of physical disabilities, but his mind as sharp as ever. Douglas, was working as a computer engineer in Bell Labs, AT&T, and couldn't be there for his father all the time. So he wanted to create an artificial intelligence that could be there for him and support him and talk to him when Douglas could not. And Douglas also says he lost a friend during 9/11 and was devastated by the thought he would never talk to his friend again and that his friend's children would never be able to talk to him. So he used this technology he'd been working on, which is effectively a kind of chatbot, but to have elements of the personality of the friend that he lost. And so that friend could be a companion. So he set up this company called True Companion. He thought there would be a commercial application for the kind of companionship that he could create with artificial intelligence. But he thought the way to do this in a way that would be recession-proof would be for the first thing to be launched on the market to be a sex robot. And this would be something for the bereaved, the disabled, the socially awkward. It would be a therapeutic tool. It would be a holistic way of improving somebody's life, or so he said. And he told me that he'd spent sort of decades perfecting the animatronics as well as the AI. And when he unveiled it in 2010, there was a lot of a big build-up to Roxy being unveiled. I was going to share my screen with you to show you what she looked like. I can't work out how to do that, so I've got a picture on my phone. I hope you can see this. This, great fanfare, thousands of people gathered around. I don't know if it was thousands, but lots of people. This is what Roxy looked like. So she had been billed as this sleek, intelligent machine who can hold your hand literally and metaphorically when you need her, but she was this huge, clunky mannequin with a very square jaw and pantomime makeup. And she had these kind of push button responses. It wasn't AI. If you touched her in a certain place, she'd say certain things. Her mouth didn't move. So the sound came from a speaker underneath her wig. It's a sort of disembodied voice, like a kind of obscene push button baby doll. And Douglas had been the talk of the show. This was the AVN Expo, which is the big adult entertainment expo, the biggest event in the adult industry calendar in Las Vegas. And he had been the talk of the whole event beforehand. And he was a kind of laughing stock afterwards among people who were in there. But I want to read you, I've got down here a few things of how Roxy True Companion was reported. Fox News repeated Douglas Hines' claim that she had a mechanical heart that powered a liquid cooling system around her body. The Daily Telegraph said she was able to discuss football and could wirelessly download her own upgrades when necessary. Spectrum, which is one of the world's leading engineering magazines, parroted Douglas's line that a staff of 19 machinists, sculptors, and welders had been employed to perfect her. ABC News said he'd spent $1 million developing her. CNN reported how Douglas said she'd been molded from the body of a fine art model and that he already had 4,000 pre-orders for her. So that was in 2010. Douglas Hines still has a website. It has big order her now buttons, and you can order her. She costs £9,995, but no one has ever admitted to owning her on any of the very strange forums that I've been on where people talk about these things. And no pictures have ever been released to journalists since this event when she was unveiled. As far as I can tell, Roxy True Companion doesn't exist. She's vaporware. But people want her to exist. And even people who really should know better, feminist writers like Laura Bates from Everyday Sexism, she wrote a big piece in the New York Times a couple of years ago, specifically talking about Roxy True Companion, because there are different modes that you can put her in. Some where she's shy, some where she's flirtatious, and there is one where I think it's called Frigid Farah, forgive me, where she's not necessarily very up for it. This is according to Douglas and his website. And these feminist campaigners like Laura Bates said, this is going to encourage men to act out rape fantasies. You have a hyper-realistic, very, very sleek machine, and men are going to act out rape fantasies on it. There was a very distinguished barrister who wrote an opinion piece in the Times of London about how we need to ban sex robots right now because they're going to enable rape or rapists to act out their darkest fantasies. All it would take is a phone call to True Companion and you'd find out they didn't exist. I spent a year and a half playing cat and mouse with Douglas Hines. He would talk to me on the phone and I'd say, I'd love to come and meet you and see your robot. And he'd say, oh no, it's not quite the right time. It's not quite the right time. Or there's a lot of, my investors don't necessarily want to see the factory. And at one point, right at the end, I said, I will come to any time and place of your choosing, with or without your robot. I just want to interview you. And that was when the emails stopped. The point is that this is obviously complete rubbish, but it's rubbish that people want to perpetuate. It's a straw man that people want to argue against. It's a big juicy story that papers want to reproduce. And it's the sort of thing that draws in people like you and me. What a sort of crazy idea. And even though looking at her, she just completely isn't what her makers claim that she is, we kind of don't see it because we're obsessed with the fantasy, the science fiction of what we want her to be. And that's kind of the same for meat grown in labs, which I'm sure you know very well. The idea that we can stop some of the environmental degradation that goes on from our overconsumption of meat by, instead of growing it in an animal, growing it in a laboratory. We all know that the current levels of eating meat are unsustainable. And the story that people want to hear is a story of we can carry on perpetuating our current behavior. We don't have to stop eating so much meat. We can carry on as normal because technology is going to save us. So we're not going to have the problems with antibiotic resistance, with greenhouse gases, with water pollution. We're not going to have problems with, E. coli, salmonella, all of the pandemics that have been linked to the keeping of animals in close quarters. We can avoid that by growing meat in laboratories. And I think a really great example of this is, I'm sure when I talk about growing meat in labs, you will all be aware of Professor Mark Post and his lab Grown Hamburger, which was revealed to the public in a very, very slick, PR-organized, Sergey Brin funded press conference in August 2013, where he lifted a cloche and unveiled this burger, this puck of lab-grown meat inside a Petri dish, even though it wasn't grown in a Petri dish. And it was a slow news day that day. It was in August 2013, and it really made headlines absolutely everywhere. And this seductive narrative has continued. And I went to Silicon Valley. Well, I went to a startup and ate a lab-grown chicken nugget as part of the research for my book. And they gave me a performance that was pretty much the same as this Mark Post performance, where I had to wait a very long time and be given a tour of the whole place. And eventually, they wouldn't tell me what I was going to be eating. And eventually, this little brown chicken nugget was given to me. And this was by a company called Just, who had been saying that they were going to be the first to sell lab-grown meat in the world, and they were going to do it that year. And I went to see them in November, so they only had a month left to get it on the market. And they gave me this lab-grown nugget to eat, and it was a very, very strange experience, because whilst it tasted like chicken, these were chicken cells that had been grown. It was not tissue, and the texture was just completely wrong. It was very, very mushy. And you know how when you eat very, very processed food, your brain, when meat doesn't taste right, your brain tells you, no, you must spit this out. So it was really, really disgusting. And they hadn't worked out where they were going to sell it yet. They were looking for a country where they said would have the right regulatory environment, because obviously it's such a difficult thing to do. It was interesting, Jack was talking about driverless cars and those dates being pushed back. They still haven't managed to sell that nugget. They still haven't managed to put it on sale anywhere. We are a year and a half down the line. But they said this to me with incredible confidence. And the reason why is because they need investment into their business so that they can have these big bioreactors. They can build these bioreactors they need to do this at scale. So they're putting on a performance that they think I will like and that I will want to report on, because it's a great story, you know, that we can all carry on exactly as before and technology is going to save the world with these amazing nuggets. They have this promotional video on their website about how the original biopsy of the meat comes from a chicken called Ian. They took a feather from the floor of the green pasture where he lives. Ian is still alive. You can eat Ian whilst watching Ian flap his wings. You know, it's a lovely story. It's a lovely narrative. But uncertainty doesn't sell. Uncertainty doesn't attract venture capitalist investment. So they weren't going to say, we know these nuggets are pretty disgusting and they're not ready. We're going to wait for something good. It was interesting because I did go and talk to Mark Post afterwards, and he is also involved in a commercial venture, and he is an academic, and he's quite bewildered by the fact that his investors don't want him to share what went wrong in his development of these technologies. And he is worried that people are going to put inferior products on the market, which is going to tarnish the entire reputation of the entire industry. Because food is a very intimate thing. If you eat something once and it's wrong, then you don't go back. So it's this idea that there's the different mindset of scientists who really want to advance what they're doing. It's sometimes at odds with the market that is trying to use that technology in the same way. And I guess what I wanted to say that was so important for me is that I'm not a scientist. I'm an investigative journalist. And what I do is really simple. I ask very obvious questions like, when is this going to come out? How do you know? And I listen to answers in depth. I don't think about what I wish was out there. And I don't go from press releases. I don't get my ideas from press releases. I think a lot of journalists do. All you need to do to fight against this kind of hype is to ask really simple questions and really listen to the answers, instead of thinking about the narratives that are quite often very influenced by science fiction and the kind of dreams that we have of the future. All you need is the will not to be seduced when you hear what you want to hear. And that's hard for all of us. It's very hard for me as a journalist when I think I've got a great story and someone's telling me what I want to hear, but then it doesn't really stand up. You have to have the courage to say, that's not for me, and pierce that hype. So it's not easy for any of us, but that's what we need to do.
Fascinating, Jenny. Do you have any things in your book about which parts of the various technologies you actually think will come good, rather than just saying, gosh, there's lots of misleading promotion, and there's a lot about people's willingness to believe things they probably should be more cautious about. But do you come down in terms of some predictions about which of these 4 areas are likely to be significantly changing people's lives for real in the foreseeable future?
I think they all are. I think it might not be from the people I'm talking to, so the robot manufacturers now, or the people making lab-grown meat now, but I think the commercial imperative for all of them is very great, with the exception of euthanasia devices. I think if we sort ourselves out and find a way of legalizing assisted dying, then there won't be such a need for these devices. But I think all of these are inevitable because of market forces, and also because of in many ways, certainly with artificial wombs, there are very strong arguments that you can save very premature babies with them. We just need to be prepared to think about them critically before they arrive, and not just be dazzled by the stories inherent in them that we want to tell ourselves.
Thanks. So I'm going to give all 3 of you another minute or so to comment on things that you heard from each other that you want to go further into. And then, so this is a note to the audience, there is an ask a question option, which some of you have seen at the bottom of the screen. And if you go in there, you will find various questions that people have raised already. You can ask your own question, and you can also vote on the questions which you think we should attend to, not just because they're the most exciting, but because they're the most critically useful, perhaps. So we will generally look at these questions broadly in the order of which are most popular. So we'll come to them shortly. But let's go around the 3 of you again with further thoughts. Gemma.
Finding out how to put myself off of me. Okay, so there's 3 things I just want to say. I'll try and keep it as short as I possibly can. So Daniela made a point while Jack was speaking about privilege in hype, and privilege around who gets to tell the stories or build the future. And I heard a science fiction writer, who I've awkwardly forgotten her name, at South by Southwest, I think it was about 2 years ago, said something in the middle of a panel once, and it stuck with me. One person's utopia is another person's dystopia. And I think as people who dabble in talking about and building and being excited about the future, we must always remember that when we talk about it, when we make predictions about it, when we say what we think is good or bad. It's just having that, being able to step back and be like, what am I projecting as utopia versus what other people might think? So that's the first thing. The second thing that I wanted to build on, which a lot of what Jenny was saying and Jack and a few of you have commented on, is this idea of like technology will save us mentality. Now, it's a difficult one because as a journalist, Jenny has obviously a very specific role in terms of asking the question, holding to account, and so on and so forth. Jack has a very specific role as an academic around, trying to get to the root of things and understanding and getting these kind of moving the research forward. Me, I'm a freelance journalist, but I also do some consulting, and I'm a broadcaster, and I do all these random things. And I sometimes spend a lot of time being like, what is my role in thinking about the future and talking about the future? Am I trying to influence things in a certain way? Am I trying to ask questions? Am I trying to hold to account? Am I trying to educate? These are all different things, and hype is used in these areas in all different ways. And I think, David, what you asked there at the end of Jenny, of which of these do we think is going to be sort of worth the hype, shall we say? That yes, okay, the hype is maybe wrong and misleading, but actually these technologies are good, and we need the hype. It's balancing this whole, how much of the placebo-esque parts of hype are we willing to be okay? Like, do we think that giving a placebo to someone is good because it makes them feel better even though we're lying, right? And it's the same kind of question with hype. It's like, how do we essentially work out what's fair and good and reasonable? What's the fair use of hype, right? And I think it comes back to, you can never really you can never really have a world completely without hype unless every single person understood science and tech to a really great degree and was not kind of influenced by narratives, by wants, by desires, which is obviously completely unreasonable. So when I talk about responsibility, I think it comes back to this: why am I even using hype? And is it for the betterment of society? And then of course, everyone has different ideas about what betterment of society means. But I think it's just continually asking that question for every single person in every single role that they are, even if it's just as a citizen, right? And the third thing I want to say, which is kind of linked to that, is around trust. So when we talk about communicating and thinking about communications, it's like, sometimes I'm thinking, should I put a message out if it's going to have an effect which is going to be counteractive? So an example might be, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment in the sort of science fraud, academic fraud space. And I feel really, really passionately that we should talk about academic fraud more. I think we should say that it's a big problem. Someone mentioned earlier on in the chat that peer review doesn't work and all these. I think we absolutely should talk about this much more. But I'm also very, very conscious that saying these things and saying them in a way that could be taken out of context could be damaging for trust in science as a whole. And obviously me, as someone who believes in science, thinks science is amazing, thinks science is really, really important, I worry about trust. So when it comes to narratives, we have to essentially work out how we explain things that's not going to reduce trust, that's not going to make things, you know, worse, that's not going to reduce funding, even though the thing actually is interesting and useful and worthwhile. But at the same time be measured, and at the same time be responsible, and at the same time be conscious of this, you know, one person's utopia is another person's dystopia. So those were kind of the sort of three things I wanted to bring up that was going through my head.
Gemma, one person's utopia is another person's dystopia. Max in the chat has asked, are you espousing moral relativism?
I did not study philosophy, so I'm not going to lie.
Do you think some futures actually are genuinely better than others, or does it all depend on your point of view?
Okay, I think I think a lot of that depends on your point of view, and I think it depends on what you're optimizing for. So if you were to take, for instance, in the batteries chapter that I have, I try and lay out the various different parts of that industry. It's not a zero-sum game, but there are things that counter against one another. So for instance, if you were to take climate change and our reliance on fossil fuels as one thing, if you take human rights and currently in today's world, and if you're to take, say, profit and speed to market and how much we value corporations staying because they employ people, right? And we don't want them to fail. If you're to take these three things as three things you might optimize for, and of course there are a whole load of other things you might want to consider. Batteries are really good for taking off our reliance on fossil fuels because obviously it means we can have electric cars. It means we can have much better renewables because we can store energy, all these sorts of things, right? But if you were to optimize for human rights, well, batteries require cobalt, which is, has huge issues in terms of human rights in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we don't currently have a really good alternative. So you would up the demand if you were to basically say, I want more batteries for climate change, but then it means you have to sacrifice human rights. And then if you're to look at something like companies, if you'd say, actually, we're going to optimize for both human rights and climate change, suddenly you have to have slow progress. And companies can't necessarily make as much money. They can't make the return. Their things are so expensive. So what I'm trying to make the point in Smoke and Mirrors, and I think Jack said it as well, about this idea of uncertainty, we need to be better with complexity and not looking for absolutist answers about what is right and wrong, what is better. We need to be able to say, this action is, worthwhile because of X, Y, and Z, but these are the downsides of it, and then we need to counter those downsides with something else, as opposed to just going, batteries are great, we should all be pushing towards batteries, this is the solution, and it being, the word that normally gets used alongside new battery technology is Holy Grail. And as we all know from the stories of the Holy Grail, being able to live forever has its downsides, especially when it comes to people being bored of you after a long period of time. So it's the same with any kind of Holy Grail technology.
So there's a need for a diversity of opinion, diversity of perspective, but not all perspectives are equally useful. It's like there's lots of different kinds of good diet, but not all diets are equally good. We can still say some diets are bad for you probably than others. Jack, what comments would you like to make in a follow-up?
So let me just pick up on something that Jenny mentioned, because I think Jenny got to the heart for me of the role of journalism and the problem of lots of contemporary science and technology journalism. And I hope I'm not misrepresenting her when I say that, but she was saying, you know, how valuable it is just to ask the right questions, which we should expect as to be the role of the journalist. And yet, when it comes to science and technology journalism, we see a sort of disconnect. We see that some science and technology journalists regard their job as either selling a particular future or advocating for one particular community, the community of scientists, and communicating that knowledge to people who are more ignorant. And I think what a discussion of hype does is it gets you to see that hype is not prediction, right? So the job of a journalist should not be to communicate those predictions to the world and say, this is what this means. Hype is politics. It's an act of claims making. And therefore we need, in journalism, a form of political journalism. It's holding power to account in a very old-fashioned way, but in a way that doesn't tend to happen very much with science and technology. I was really taken by a comment actually from Eva Pascoe in the chat, who says, as an investor, I use hype to scope demand, and then she goes on to say that it can also prime customers, which is a very honest take on what hype is for her, that it's clearly an act of claims making and testing a market. And the way that she's expressing it is as a politician would talk about expectations management, right? You know what sort of thing you're engaged with. You need to be able to come up with something that you think is valuable and sell it to the world. And it is the job of the rest of us to say, well, are we buying that, right? And so that should be the critical and entirely healthy critical discussion that we engage with. To Gemma's point about utopias and dystopias, you know, it would be, we don't need to get into a discussion of relativism and postmodernism and whether we can talk about social progress. I can go there if you want me to, but you don't want me to. To say that different people have different ideas of the future, right, is a very old and very boring statement in politics. It's what politics is all about. It's about defining the good life and working out how we get there. I am really surprised at the inability of the AI community to ask themselves this question. Which future are we going towards? At the moment, we have a huge number of initiatives around AI that call things like beneficial AI and AI for good and safe AI. And it tends to be that when you ask, well, good for whom, right? Who benefits from this technology? Nobody's yet worked out the answers. Nobody's even bothered yet asking those questions, which is profoundly troubling if we consider the momentum that is building up around artificial intelligence. I'll leave it there. I won't go on.
Why can't it be that everybody benefits from AI?
Because that doesn't make any sense. I mean, it does make sense in the sense of, I mean, everybody could benefit, but people would benefit differentially, right? We need to engage with the history of technology here, which is to say that technologies do not benefit everybody equally. Yes, everybody may benefit a bit, although the history of technology is not great in that regard. But one of the uncomfortable facts about technological progress is that it widens rather than narrows inequality, right? That's a problem. And it's a problem that we should take seriously, and which is not to say that that's inevitable, right? Technology managed well can have transformative benefits that are for the people that are worst off in society, but it doesn't just happen by accident.
Thanks.
Can I just add something really quick, David, to that I think I was thinking a lot about, specifically with the AI chapter, actually, when I was researching that, is AI is just an extension of humans. It's like allowing us to do what society already does, but at a bigger scale. It makes more decisions than we already make, you know, and one of the things that I was thinking a lot about is when we think about AI solving society, it's like, well, we kind of have to solve society first before we, which obviously is not a thing, right? You can't just solve society. But if you're to look at the ideas of, computer says no mentality within government, for instance, right? That's not actually computers. That's, the inability of people to make decisions. And we have a lot of systems already in society that are human made that don't necessarily work. And it's the same with AI. So if we're just accentuating what we already have, it's also something around data, right? So like if you were to try and build a, database that is fair, so for instance, we talk a lot about the issues with racial profiling and whatnot with AI technologies. Do you build a database that is reflective of society right now, which is society isn't good for people from ethnic backgrounds, for women, for people who are, aren't cis, do we build a data set that reflects that and say to the AI, make it better? Or do we build a data set that's not reflective of society, and we build something that's idealistically what we want and somehow trying to get, consensus around that and then run the AI on that? At the end of the day, it's an extension of what we already have as society. So if we keep saying, we need to make sure the tech is good, it's not enough. We have to actually say, well, we have to make our systems better first. And then you get into the exact same conversations we've been having for millennia, which is, how do you make society better? How do we agree as to what society looks good? So I think that's why you can't say AI is good for everyone, because it's just saying like society can be good for everyone, which is idealistic.
Right. So in order to solve the question of AI ethics, we have to revisit the question of human ethics. In a sense, your chapter on AI does that too. It sets, there are 6 dimensions of ethical choice, and people tend to like one set of 3 or another set of 3, depending on your overall disposition. And you don't obviously come up with a comprehensive answer there, but you do, I think, set up the question nicely. Jenny, let's bring you in for a minute before we go to Q&A. And I'll be taking the questions.
Because I got to speak last, I maybe addressed a lot of the points that I wanted to address when I was speaking. But I would say I totally agree with Gemma that complexity is the key here. You get to complexity by being prepared to ask very simple and very basic questions. And I think Jack is absolutely right in what he said about journalism. And I think perhaps the reason why I was able to do the reporting that I did is because I'm not a technology journalist. I've never been a technology journalist. So I was able to ask these very basic questions. And quite often when I was having the smoke and mirrors done in front of me, people were assuming that I was part of this game that had been played before many other times with technology journalists, and that I was going to kind of play along, but I wasn't aware of the rules of that game. It's about allowing yourself to look stupid by asking very simple questions that will lead you to a nuanced picture, which might not be entertaining in the same way, but will reach you, will make you mean that you reach a more fulfilling conclusion.
Thanks. Let's start by taking a question which is at the top of the list by Nesapi. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name right. To what extent does the panel consider tech hype may be skewing research agendas and the allocation of funding away from potentially more important innovations? And before I answer that, I'll just say to the audience, if you're posting questions in the chat, they probably can't be voted, so you can convert them from questions in chat into the Q&A. I think you can just press a button and do that. And we won't be able to get to all of the questions, so I will look to the audience to help me prioritize these. Anyway, let's have some answers to this question by whoever wants to bust in.
I would just very quickly say, it's a very difficult one to assess, right? But if you think about research done in biology, ask any biologist and they will say, if we put the word cancer in our grant application, we are far more likely to get the funding, regardless of how applied the research is. If you're doing really basic research, which might in many years' time inform some form of therapeutic, if you put cancer in your application, you're more likely to get funding. So there's a real example of where hype is used essentially to try and compete against others that are gunning for the same funding. Just one example I wanted to throw out to begin with.
Thanks. Anybody else want to answer that?
I would just say, I mean, again, it's not something that I have a massively broad overview of, but I would think it's clear that research agendas are being skewed by this, and also, you know, startups entirely. You know, all of this stuff depends on who's going to give you money. They'll give you money if they like the idea and they think it has traction, and the more that you can make the idea sparkly and shiny, the more it's going to attract money. I know that Mark Post, who invented the first lab-grown burger, was specifically trying to get funding from people outside the universities that he worked in, because the funding had dried up, and was specifically trying to do stunty things as much as possible, because otherwise his life's work would kind of come to nothing. So, you know, beyond any doubt, hype skews funding of research.
You also got to think about it from a political perspective, right? I mean, and this is one of the big arguments that I'm trying to make in the book too, as to why citizens should care about this, even if you don't, you know, aren't in science and tech, or don't really think of it as that important in your day-to-day life. You vote for people that say certain things. And, you know, I would actually take one example again from the cancer chapter, where David Cameron set up, I think it was called the Cancer Fund at the time, which was essentially to try and fund, or he said in his manifesto, which, you know, he used to get himself voted in the first place, the Cancer Fund would be set up to fund all the therapeutics that the NHS currently decides, you know, uses the term decides not to, is denying the public these therapeutics, when in actual fact, you know, NICE is set up to try and assess value. You know, if something only gives you 3 months, is it worth it versus another one when we're in a public health system, right? So that's something you use to get elected. So it's important that people in the general public understand context of hype, because at the end of the day, you know, it does skew research agenda from many different angles, whether it's grant funding, whether it's which politicians are in power, whether it's regulation, and also, you know, consumer demand at the end of the day. So I think it's quite a hard thing to measure and to find like data that is, you know, there's so many factors when it comes to hype that it's really difficult to find the numbers that back it up. But there's plenty of good examples of where you can see it's been intentionally used as a tool, which would suggest people believe that it's going to be worthwhile.
So I think there's one additional issue here, which is, so does hype skew funding? Well, yes, of course. But in order to use the word skew, we sort of have to presume that there's a perfect direction that funding should be going in, and yes, there is no factual basis on which to make that decision. So hype is sort of the only basis on which to make that decision. And the history of science funding is one in which, yes, Nixon's war on cancer was from one view, a bunch of empty promises, but from another led to the creation of the National Institutes of Health and gigantic increases in funding for biomedicine. The same with the Human Genome Project, right? Unfulfilled promises, but massive investments in biomedicine. So I think the worry is not so much the skewing of and the faddishness of research funding, because I think that's part of what research funding is. It's the concentration of research funding into particular areas, but especially as science and technology get more and more expensive. So I think you can look with a critical eye on the Human Brain Project, for example, €1 billion initiative to fund neuroscience, and to say, was that a good use of money? Well, it looked like the concentration of resources in a real all your eggs in one basket type scenario. Does that lead to the greatest scientific productivity and innovative possibility? Well, probably not. And that would be my concern.
Whilst you've got the microphone, maybe I could ask you to comment on a point that Vicky has just raised in the chat, which is, she says she's surprised by your comment about technology and increasing inequality. Millions of people in developed countries benefited from access to markets, knowledge and like-minded people, thanks to cheap mobile phones, which are now prevalent even in poorest communities. So she's saying that at least in some cases, technology will reach to all levels of the market once it's had enough time.
Yeah, absolutely. So technology can have profound impacts upon poverty, right? But that's not the same thing as saying that it reduces inequality. So the people at the bottom can still be lifted up, but the people at the top will get lifted up even more. The gap between richer and poor, and I think that's one of those trends that we need to engage with, and we need to engage with what it was about mobile phones that made it such a profoundly transformative technology. And there we have some really interesting questions of infrastructural leapfrogging in the countries where mobile phones were transformative, and we have, the lack of conservative incumbents stopping new market entrants. So there's some really interesting systemic points there. Same, the lessons from the Green Revolution, which had profound impacts upon some of the world's poorest people, most of which were positive. But still, right, the fact is that the people who are best off will benefit the most from technological innovation. And that's just, something that we need to deal with and work out how to come up with alternatives for, if we care about inequality.
We may come back to that shortly, but let's move to a question by Anna Sloan. Are there no examples of technology that started as hype but became groundbreaking? Can you actually get innovation and funding without hype?
So is the question, can you get it without hype, or is there examples of technologies existing because of hype?
I'm just reading it. Is there innovation without hype? And is there no examples of technology that started as hype but became groundbreaking? So maybe hype isn't that bad, at least in some cases.
So if you take one example from the quantum computing chapter that I've written around a company called D-Wave, which some people might be familiar with if you follow that space. D-Wave got a lot of hype quite a few years ago around seemingly building the very first quantum computer, and this was a while back. This was before all the sort of current discussion around IBM and Google and Microsoft, and they said, we've built this quantum computer and it's got 100 qubits, and then 6 months later it's got 500 qubits, and then within a year it had 1,000 qubits, and this is literally before we even had any press announcements or anything around Google and IBM. And as we all know, or maybe not all know, right now, the sort of status we're at is less than 100 qubits with Google and IBM. So it seems weird that there was a company in years gone by who was able to get to thousands of qubits when if, Google and whatnot couldn't get to less than 100 right now. It doesn't make sense, right? But that was the narrative they used. They said, we've got loads of qubits and there was loads of hype, got a load of investment, VCs jumped in, they got pre-orders, they got orders. And over time, the sort of journalists and the academics in the space that were like, hold on, what's this random company? Who are they? And why are they saying they're able to do this? That's not possible. Realized that what they were doing was they were using not qubits, but something called a quantum annealer. But they rode on the hype. They didn't necessarily lie, but they didn't correct journalists when they were covering the topic. And they didn't sort of try and die the hype down, right? And they massively benefited from it, got a whole load of money, a whole load of funding. And as a result, they've now kind of got to the point where they've built something that is useful in certain ways. It's not a quantum computer, it's a different kind of machine. But I would argue they wouldn't have got there had they not had that hype a couple of years ago. Is that okay? Is that something that we're happy about? Oh, it's great. We've got this tech that could be used for X, Y, and Z, and we wouldn't have got it without this hype. I would argue that I think it's not responsible and that we could have got there by other means, and that there is a sort of opportunity cost here. But then other people who have, who want that technology and think that it's really useful would maybe argue in a different way. So, there's many, many examples. I don't think VR would be in this space that it's in right now had it not had all the hype that it's had over the last 10 years. VR's a terrible technology. It doesn't, so, but it's had lots of hype, lots of people like it, lots of money being spent, particularly in advertising. And I know that because I was in an innovation team when everyone wanted to invest in VR. The amount of money that flowed from companies through advertising campaigns in VR is absolutely insane. And it's not at the stage that everyone said it would still. So that's that second point in the question. I think that, you know, yeah, there are examples. Again, it just comes back to, do you think it was a fair, right, responsible thing to do based on opportunity cost?
I'd want to say about VR as well is that it's a really good example of the hype cycle, isn't it? Because you have in the early 90s, people were, you know, wearing virtual reality headsets and putting on those gloves and supposed to be kind of being, you know, this was the new gaming of the future, and it absolutely sank without a trace. The point that we have to remember about all of this is that you have to play a longer game with all of these things, that even if these things crash and burn, the ideas that either are worth having or that continue to capture our imaginations will rise again if you're looking at it over a period of time.
I think though, even the idea of hype cycle is quite interesting. I mean, if we think about like the Gartner hype cycle, everyone I'm sure on this call has probably heard of the Gartner hype cycle, considering we're talking to London Futurists. I think Gartner hype cycle is hype itself. Everyone gets excited about when it's going to be released. Oh, what's moved from this tranche to that tranche? And it means something, the publication of what is hype. It's like, good, we've got, every year we get something to help us navigate hype. And then it's used without criticism a lot of the time. It's used without critical thinking. It's taken as the shortcut. So there's an interesting point to be made, I think, around, you know, at the end of the book, I sort of try and give like 9 tips to help you see past hype. And it's basically, how do you critically think? And number 10, you know, I say, this is what I would write if I was going to do a how-to list. And number 10 is going, don't follow any list. You have to think for yourself. If you follow any list, you're going to get blinkered. So I think the hype cycle in and of itself is something that can cause issues.
I would completely agree. The Gartner hype. So Gartner are players, not spectators of hype. And one of the ways in which they contribute to the reinforcement of hype is by reinforcing this idea of technological determinism, which is to say that a technology starts and its trajectory towards eventual impact is certain. It's just a question of speed, right? And actually what happens is that most technologies fail and technologies change shape, often unrecognizably. So the technology that we predict is not the technology that we end with, which Gartner can tell us very little about. To the point of it about, though, can we have innovation without hype? I think that's a really important challenge for us, because the history of technology is a history partly of design and expectation and fulfilling those expectations, but it's also a history of serendipity, which is that innovation is accidental. And there's a real danger that if the hype bubbles get too big, then science and technology become unable to see their own opportunities. You know, what might the spin-offs be for AI that have transformative benefits? Well, if we're stuck in a hype bubble that's presuming the beneficiaries are these people, and these people, we might stop looking for those. And that's what I worry about.
It's also, I think, dependent on who's hyping and in what context, right? If you look at something like IoT, Internet of Things, in a sort of consumer, you know, general media, Twitter context, IoT is like old hat. Connected umbrella? Why do I need a connected umbrella? That's stupid. You know, all these, there's a sort of taking the mick of IoT. But if you take it and look at it from an industrial perspective, IoT is kind of at the peak of its hype, right? That's like what's fueling factories becoming digital and the ability to monitor energy of huge buildings and so on and so forth. So that's also the problem I have with the hype cycle is like, in what context? Because IoT hype is different depending on the audience in which it's being kind of proliferated through. And I think that matters too, when we kind of look at whether or not it's problematic. And I would argue that IoT doesn't need any consumer hype right now at all for it to be a useful technology. The question being though, did it need to go through the consumer hype to get to where it is now? That's a fair question. It's something I ask a lot with quantum computing, like, do we even need to hype technologies that don't touch the consumer? but that's something separate.
Let's try and answer a few more questions. Hopefully we can get through 3 more if we are focused. Congratulations to everybody for not mentioning a COVID pandemic yet.
But it's down in the comments, David. You're missing it.
I'm seeing it there, yes. But I think there is a question about COVID, and a question I think is about hype. The question is from Robert Coombs. I think he's saying that he's hearing a lot of possible hype that the COVID pandemic is going to change everything. He keeps reading that many aspects of life as we know it will change: work, sports, restaurants. But he's skeptical of any of the panelists' views as to whether there will be fundamental changes. He refers to, for example, the Spanish flu, which didn't seem to change society that much at the time, although Rita in a comment says, well, it's one of the causes for women having votes in the US in 1920 because there was a glut of women after the First War and the epidemic.
I think the key word here is will. You asked what will happen, or will the pandemic have these effects? And the answer, the honest answer, the only answer is we don't know. That's literally the only answer to will there be change, right? So I would kind of turn it back around and say the key thing that I think people that are saying these things or reading these things or are interested in these things should be thinking about is trying to map the systems where COVID has an impact and try and see what might change, what's already changing, what are the problems that you can see in the short term, medium term, and long term, and try and find a way of, again, living with that complexity and trying to navigate that complexity, as opposed to trying to find these sort of absolutist answers to something that we simply absolutely cannot know. And I hope that there's a bit more effort put into these sort of system analyses in the public press, shall we say, that I haven't really seen all that much of at the moment. There's quite a lot of hot takes and absolutist ideas.
So Gemma's sort of sitting on the fence on this, not giving a
There's
will
nothing
answer.
wrong with sitting on the fence. This is another thing that I want to say. We're so trying to find everyone to land on a side. Like, look what's happened to politics because we want everyone to land on a side. Fence sitting is good, and everyone should be happy sitting on fences. Maybe put a cushion on so it's not so uncomfortable, but nuance is important.
I would say that you're totally right to say that we don't know, because of course we don't know. I would imagine, in my opinion, one of the things would change as somebody who has spent my entire career working from home. I think there is a lot of work that people assumed could only be done in offices that they're now realizing can be done remotely. And I hope this will allow for more flexibility with people's home lives now that people know that people can work remotely. But beyond that, I really don't know. I think we are moving through a period of absolutely rapid change. And to be honest with you, none of us know what's going to be happening in 3 weeks. So I wouldn't say anything beyond that.
So we can map out scenarios, but we can't, and it's useful to think through the scenarios to figure out which of them are more credible. Let's hear from Jack as well.
Sorry, all I would add just quickly on that one is that, so my concern about the pandemic is that it creates a sense of desperation, which could lead to very poor decision-making when it comes to new technologies. So the desperation for a vaccine is obviously the clear technological fix for this, but in the nearer term, the arguments that are already festering about contact tracing apps as a sort of way to unlock our freedoms point to some of the dynamics that we've been talking about this evening. The way in which, you know, people's legitimate concerns, for example, over privacy, get steamrolled, but as part of the desperation for innovation, and that's a false choice.
Thanks.
I'd also like to say something very quickly about all of this, which is that part of what I found very interesting in doing the research for my book is the extent to which we look to technology to solve problems that we can solve with changes of behavior that we don't want to make. And obviously, I'm not suggesting that we carry on doing social distancing for the rest of our lives, but the way that we are desperate for a technological solution to this reveals very much about how we rely on technology. And you know, what I've looked at is how we are relying on technology to overcome ethical problems. But I think ultimately now our default assumption is that tech is going to save us, and when it can't, we're kind of flailing around, really.
Maybe you can answer the next question, Jenny, as well. It's a question about what's it like to write a book. At least some of the audience are interested in lessons from writing books for people who feel themselves on that route. So we'll ask all three of you to answer, because all three of you are published authors or about to be published authors.
What's it like writing a book? I absolutely loved it. I've done a lot of different things in my life. I have never done anything more professionally or personally fulfilling. The good thing about writing non-fiction, I could never write fiction because there's no structure, but the good thing about non-fiction is that before you begin, you do have to know pretty much what you're going to put in each chapter. And it was just a total delight from beginning to end, which I wasn't expecting it to be. And I hope that I'll get to do many more.
I plus one to all of what Jenny just said. I have so much respect for fiction writers. It's unreal after doing nonfiction, and I also really enjoyed it. It was a roller coaster, though, mind you. There's a lot of self doubt, a lot of like, 1 minute you're like, this paragraph's amazing, I've made such an amazing point, and then the next paragraph you're like, who am I to be writing this book? This is horrific. But I'm working on book 2 at the moment, so I definitely enjoyed the process. I think one thing that I would add, particularly with nonfiction, that I went on a really interesting journey to try and explore and make better so that I could write as useful and interesting a book as possible, is how do you create a compelling narrative in the scope of a nonfiction book that maybe feels similar to a fiction book. And the reason I kind of thought a lot about that is when I first was going out to publishers, or my agent was going out to publishers with the proposal, the biggest piece of feedback we were getting was like, what's the narrative? Why is this not just 9 essays about 9 different technologies and you look at them critically, sort of thing? And so I had to think really deeply about kind of what point I was trying to make. And the point I end up making is around personal responsibility, around critical thinking, and how do we look at ourselves, essentially. So there's a sort of Trojan horse of hype, shall we say, that takes you to something hopefully a bit more meaningful. I would urge anyone who's thinking about writing, particularly nonfiction, to really think about what journey are you trying to take the reader on? Like, why are you writing this? Like, what's the purpose of it? Beyond getting ideas out. That I believe, and hopefully people who, if you pre-order my book and read it, believe what makes a good book, a good nonfiction book, is if it's not just there's a place for explainer books, there's a place for how-to books, but if you want to write something that's a sort of big idea non-fiction book, you have to work out what it is that you want the reader to do or think or ponder on as a result. So I would urge anyone to really think very hard and play with what is that narrative and what's that journey you're trying to take a reader on. What's the hero's journey, even though it's non-fiction. Can
you give us a hint as to what book 2 is about?
Science fraud. So I mentioned earlier on academic fraud. Yeah, so whistleblowers within academia. I saw someone mentioning about peer review in here. So there's a few academics. So if any of you know about academic fraud, hit me up because I'll write about you.
Jack, any comments on authoring or any of the other topics?
I wouldn't dare to give anybody advice. So as an academic, I'm in a very different position, which is that writing books for me is an extraordinary privilege rather than so there's very little at stake. So if anybody is interested in the ideas, that's a bonus, but I don't need it to put bread on the table. So don't get advice from academics. Most academics are terrible writers. I hope I'm not, but that's all I'd say.
And what's the name of your book?
My book is called Who's Driving Innovation?
Thanks. So we should look out for that as well. Let's try and roll one more question in. That's the one that's come up as a dark horse to the outside. I think it's a good question to finish on. It's on the possible futures of journalism. Is hype journalism the new norm? And factual valued journalism dead, leading to more smoke and mirrors?
Jenny, I'm going to let you go first on that one.
Yes, I'm itching to go first on this. I would say no, because I'm going to say they both coexist. And the reason why they coexist is because of the way journalism is funded at the moment. That you either get people who are looking at press releases and reproducing, regurgitating what they've been told, or what they can look at on the internet with a single bit of Google, what's on page 1 of Google and a press release at most. because they're not being paid very much and they have to do several of these articles a day. Or I hope there is an appetite for long reads, the sort of thing that I do, or podcasts, or things which are like a warm bath where somebody really sits and explains things to you. I think the stuff in the middle, so the things that are maybe 1,200 words, I think there's much less space for. But I think when people consume journalism, they either really want quick bites of things, headlines, or they want things that are a bit trashy and haven't really been thought through. Or I think people are increasingly prepared to pay for things where they see that a lot of time and effort has gone into it. I hope so, because my career depends on it. But in my experience, I mean, I know that The Guardian have metrics where they look at who donates to The Guardian after what articles, and that they donate after the big investigations or after the long reads. So long may that continue.
I would, from my perspective, I would, because I'm not a journalist. I don't think of myself as a journalist, right? I'm a writer. And I think that we're not always very good at demarcating like what the difference is between different forms of messaging that goes on mainstream outlets, you know, because it's very easy when you weigh up something like The Guardian versus a blog versus like a corporate blog, essentially, and you can, you know, be like, well, The Guardian does journalism and the corporate blog is selling, is marketing, and a personal blog is ruminations, right? But actually, if you were to look at The Guardian and look at all the different things The Guardian publishes, it's not enough to say that's all journalism. There's many different things that happen. There's explainers in there, there's how-to guides, there's long-form investigative, there's culture. And then there's also the stuff that, you know, they put these are the best headphones so they can get Amazon affiliate money. Like, there's all different things that happen within newspapers. And I think nowadays we still are kind of latching onto this idea of journalism being a thing that encapsulates all of that. And I think as we start to understand a bit more, and I think it's happening because of the changing business models of media, understand how media works, what is content, what are the different kinds of content. And also we start to appreciate that good writing and good systems journalism and good investigations don't always necessarily have to happen in the places that you expect them. And vice versa, rubbish stuff isn't only in the places you expect rubbish stuff. I think that will create a bit of a healthier ecosystem, both in terms of the business of journalism, but also in terms of people being able to cut through what's rubbish and what's good, in my opinion.
Closing words, Jack?
Well, I can't really add to the expertise of my co-panelists because I know less about it, other than, you know, the point of principle, I think, is an important thing here. That, I mean, as Jenny and Gemma described, journalism as a trade is in turmoil, which is troubling. There's a danger that in a desperation to find a way to make it financially sustainable, journalism ends up undermining itself. And I think the recovery and self-confidence of old principles about holding power to account are really, really vital here. And as we've discussed, you know, this evening, I think particularly so when it comes to science and technology, because science and technology are more powerful forces in our society than they used to be, and yet they are still covered in a very naive way on the whole. There are all sorts of bright spots within journalism, and the nice thing about the diversity of sources that we can all read is that we can find those bright spots without having to live in town X or whatever it is.
I think just to very quickly add to that, I think it's not just about recovering old principles of journalism. I think it's people understanding how the business of journalism works. I think if more people could get that, could understand that you have to put ads on things in order to pay for stuff, that you have to do affiliate links in order to pay for stuff, that you have to have paywalls in order to pay for stuff. If that was just clear and obvious and not this thing that journalists feel they have to hide sometimes, you know, like, oh, it's a bit dirty to do, if you're a freelance journalist, to also do corporate editorial. No, you got to pay your rent so that you can afford to then go do a really good investigative journalist piece that you're not necessarily going to get paid that well to do. So if we're more upfront about how this stuff is made, I think that's going to help people understand what the purpose and what the context is of each piece.
So here's to more bright spots in journalism, more bright spots in writing of all sorts, as we help the society as a whole to come to terms with a more complicated, a more sophisticated, a more probabilistic understanding of the possibilities facing us in society. possibilities of technology and possibility of human relations being updated. I want to thank my three panelists very much for bravely coming on here. I want to thank the audience for putting up, in some cases, it seems, with some internet troubles. It seems that at least some of you had difficulties with Crowdcast. I'm interested to understand more. By all means, drop me a line about that before I fully commit to using this tool as opposed to, say, Zoom. I want to have quite a few experiments with it, and thanks for putting up with the experiments today. There is another London Futurists meeting on Saturday, this Saturday at 2 o'clock, when we're going to look at options for using various methods, including technology, but others as well, to enhance human resilience, to make us less prone to infections, less prone to mental disturbances, less prone to irrationality, less prone to tribalism, less prone to consumerism. So that's the subject for Tuesday. If you click on the button at the bottom of the screen, you'll probably go to a page where you can find out more about that. And thanks to everybody. And again, I want to thank Gemma, Jenny, and Jack for coming on this London Futurist show.
Thank you for having us. Cheers.
Thank you.
So I'll let you leave now. There's no close down. The thing remains visible. Now I've got to press a stop button somewhere, haven't I? Here we go. End broadcast. Right. Stop the broadcast. That was really nice,
guys. Thanks, Gemma. Thanks, Jenny.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you both. Awesome.
Good luck
So
with
much
your
fun.
launch, Gemma.